Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing on CCTV News. I'm your host, Geun-hye. On today's program, a fresh chapter. South Korea's president pays a historic visit to Iran, bringing with her the biggest foreign delegation to set foot in the country after a crushing sanctions were lifted off Tehran earlier this year. An encounter in the skies. Yet another U.S.-Russia fighter jet face-off escalates tensions between the two major powers as both sides stick to their guns and show no signs of backing down. South Korean President Geun-hye is in Iran for a three-day visit. It's the first time that a South Korean president had visited Iran since the two countries established diplomatic relations in the year 1962. The two sides are expected to sign several trade deals worth billions of dollars and push economic ties to a new high. Besides that, nuclear disarmament in the Korean Peninsula is a focal point of the top-level meeting.
Breaking new ground. South Korean President Park Geun-hye is in Iran to promote bilateral ties between the two sides. Park met with her Iranian counterpart Hassan Rouhani on Monday, and the two leaders pledged to triple their annual trade volume to $18 billion. South Korea used to be one of the biggest buyers of Iranian oil, but imports plunged as a result of sanctions. But now, with sanctions lifted, Tehran hopes to increase its export to Seoul this month to 400,000 barrels per day, 4 times up from the current 100,000 barrels. Park also met with Iran's Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who said Tehran and Seoul would benefit from continuous and stable relations, free of U.S. influence. Security was also high on the meeting agenda. Iranian President Hassan Rouhani has thrown his support behind nuclear disarmament in the Korean Peninsula.
We are against building any sort of weapon of mass destruction. Our demand is a world free of weapons of mass destruction, and in particular, a Korean Peninsula and the Middle East free of such destructive weapons, especially nuclear weapons.
The Tehran meeting follows a buildup of tensions between South Korea and the DPRK. Pyongyang carried out its 4th nuclear test in January, followed by a long-range rocket launch a month later. In recent weeks, the DPRK has held a series of missile tests. Analysts believe that bilateral cooperation between Iran and South Korea will help push for a nuclear-free Korean Peninsula.
Iran could possibly offer help in realizing a Korean peninsula free from nuclear weapons thanks to the sound relationship between Iran and South Korea.
South Korea is among nations vying to boost economic links with Tehran after the Islamic Republic won relief from international sanctions. European companies have flocked to Iran's newly opened market for business. Chinese President Xi Jinping visited Iran in January, and South African President Jacob Zuma made his trip in April. The world is ready to embrace an open and self-assured Iran, and both sides are set to benefit from their economic and cultural exchanges.
For more on this South Korea and Iran ties, we are joined in the Beijing studio Teng Jianqun, who is the director of the Center for Arms Control from the China Institute of International Studies. Welcome, sir, to our program. Meanwhile, joining us from Washington, D.C. in the United States, we're having Ms. Geun-hye Lim, who is a lecturer of Korean Studies at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. She's originally coming from South Korea. Meanwhile, joining us in Tehran, in Iran, we're having Mr. Mohammad Marandi, Dean of the World Faculty Studies at the University of Tehran. Welcome to the three of you. This is also quite a big day, Professor Marandi, for Iran, biggest delegation from South Korea since the establishment of relations back in the 1960s, and huge tag of bilateral trade and economic deals, Professor.
Yes, this is the first visit at this level from South Korea to Iran, and Iran and South Korea have always had very strong relations, especially economic relations between the two countries have been very good. Of course, after the United States began to impose secondary sanctions and put pressure on South Korea, that trade declined. But I think now the South Korean government is interested in returning that to normal, and especially since countries on the other side of the Persian Gulf are showing signs of economic difficulty and potentially future instability, the South Korean government would like to focus more on Iran so that they don't have all their eggs in the wrong basket.
Ms. Lim, though, 400,000 barrels a day oil imports from Iran to South Korea, together with many other business and economic deals. But the question is, can Seoul have a relationship with Tehran free from U.S. influence, as the meeting was indicated between your president and also Mr. Khomeini, who is the spiritual leader of Iran?
Yes, as the other panelist, Professor Murandi, talked, when the relationship, especially between our ally, the United States, and the Middle East, especially Iran, was not that good, of course, South Korea's diplomatic relationship or trade relationship with Iran also was somewhat troubling. But as again, the Professor Murandi pointed out, our relationship has been pretty steady, even though sometimes it was like wax and waning, but still it has been steadily, I think, stable for a long time. So this actually specific summit was very encouraging in many ways, not only just economically or culturally or historically, even strategically as well. So yeah, I think just, this was a pretty encouraging moment.
But Ms. Lim, we understand at this moment there are still some kinds of bilateral sanctions the U.S. has toward Iran, including some obstacles for the money transaction into Iran. We also heard some recent cases between the two countries. Others have also been influenced by the U.S. attitude. Can South Korea act differently?
Yeah, for example, last year when the President Park visited the Beijing, at the Tiananmen Square, when she was watching the military parade, many actually Washington policymakers, they were not that happy either. But I do think between the allies, I think these two countries can respect each other's different position, and I do believe, even our Washington counterparts as well, they will appreciate the South Korea's calculation in terms of our national interest.
Talking about national interest, we
and
have
of course,
talking about national interest, we also have Mr. Teng sitting here in Beijing with us. Is it more economic and trade, or is it more geopolitical?
Both, I think, since Iran is a very important country in the Middle East, especially after the lift of sanctions against Iran from the Western countries. So I think Iran has already become a very favorite state at this moment, and ROK, of course, under the leadership of President Park Geun-hye, is a very important country in Northeast Asia. So the cooperation between the two sides, both in trade and also in geopolitics, because the Middle East has become a very important region for any country, especially after the lift of sanctions against Iran. I'm sure many country leaders went there and paid state visit and also try their best to promote the cooperation or enhance the cooperation in various areas.
Yes, indeed. We've already seen Chinese President Xi Jinping visited Iran in the month of January, and then Japan followed by an investment treaty with Iran as well. Now we see the South Korean president in Iran, unprecedented for the country's history for more than 5 decades. Is there going to be much competition among countries for the strategic interest in Iran? What does that mean for China?
So far, I think there are many complementarities among the countries concerned. For example, China's infrastructure investment and also the labor, the cheap labor, also contribute greatly for the development of Iran, especially in recently. For example, Iran's subway actually is a big deal made between China and Iran. So I think these complementarities will give countries concerned, no matter you are a developed country or a developing country, you can benefit from the cooperation between China and also Iran.
Are we going to see much competition, Ms. Lim? Because according to President Park Geun-hye, the delegation is very much interested in contracts about construction, about autos, and also about electronics. Some of these overlapping with some of the other countries in Northeast Asia, Japan, China, for example.
Yes, that's very true. As the other panelists pointed out, between the Middle East and the Northeast Asia, there are complementarity. But the thing is, among the Northeast Asian countries, we do definitely a competitive structure, especially in terms of the competitive advantage. So I do see that kind of competition, but I don't want to see that kind of zero-sum game-like a competition here in this region. For example, this time, I mean, the President Park not only just encouraged all this conventional industry like a plant or shipbuilding or those heavy industry, but also she also encouraged more like a softer or light or more high technology oriented industries as well. So I think we can diversify all this kind of trading products more than before.
Despite all of this diversity we talk about, still many people are interested in Iran's oil. Iran's oil export have risen sharply since the lifting of sanctions. The country has set its sights on exporting 4 million barrels of crude oil every day. Buyers of Iranian crude worldwide have been going up in numbers dramatically. Besides long-term customers like China, European countries are also increasing their orders. Asian countries, Japan, South Korea, we talked about, who do not enjoy large oil reserves, have also plunged into Iran's oil market. India has also raised its oil imports from Iran significantly. Professor Morandi, what does that mean? This is certainly a very pleasant situation, I guess, for Tehran.
Yes, it's important for Iran, obviously, to increase its exports. Of course, Iran is attempting to increase its petrochemical production as well as its refinery capacity as well. It does not want to just simply export crude oil. But the market is looking to Iran very favorably. As I was saying earlier, countries do not want to import all of their oil from Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and Kuwait because any potential instability on the other side of the Persian Gulf could create huge damage to those countries. So they want to balance their imports, and that is something that the Iranians favor as well. There's also the issue of natural gas. Iran has the second largest natural gas reserves in the world after Russia, and there is an enormous potential in that regard. Another issue I think that's important to note is that Iran has a policy of looking to the east, and it does recognize that the balance of power and is shifting towards Asia, and that Asian powers are on the rise. And that gives good opportunity for China, countries like China and South Korea, while there is competition. But it is, on the whole, favorable towards these countries because Iran doesn't have a history of colonialism with these countries, unlike Europe and the United States.
But Mr. Tang, here in Beijing, we've heard some kinds of rumors talking about the price for oil exports Iran has toward the European countries. At least some of them could be higher than those exported to China, the longtime trade partner, despite sanctions against Iran in the previous decades. What do you make of it?
Of course, this is actually a marketing policy by Iran at this moment. After decades of sanctions, Iran would like to have a fast development of relations between Iran and European countries. China, of course, has been a long partner in regional affairs and also in trade. So Iran would like to maintain the a little bit higher price and simultaneously gave a lower price to the European countries.
Well, you sound very understanding.
Yeah, this is actually a marketing policy to the European countries.
All right, big smile from Professor Morandi. Explain to us what exactly happening.
Well, I'm not well aware of the specifics of the Iranian oil trade relationship with Europe, but I think that what your guest in the studio said is true, that initially when Iran is attempting to regain new markets, it may give some a better or more favorable price in order to persuade buyers to move away from their current suppliers. But I do really believe that in Iran there is a very favorable view towards countries like China and South Korea, because they have maintained good relations with Iran during the difficult times when the United States was putting a lot of pressure on Iran.
Right.
The very fact that the Chinese president came to Iran was a big issue in the country. And I think the Iranians are looking to see if the Chinese are prepared to invest more in the country, and especially many are looking to see how the One Belt, One Road initiative
Right.
will develop.
Right. But these are economic and trade ties. There's another very important layer, geopolitical, we haven't touched on. We must touch on that. Professor Morandi, we understand the president of Iran, Mr. Rouhani, has already expressed he is expecting a nuclear-free Korean peninsula. That's a big statement coming from a longtime ally of DPRK, I have to say.
Well, actually, it's not a new policy. The Iranian policy has always been that it opposes nuclear weapons in the Middle East or West Asia and North Africa, as well as the Korean Peninsula. And that is directed both towards the North Korean government as well as the United States, which has nuclear weapons in South Korea. In the Middle East, of course, the only country that has nuclear weapons is the Israeli regime. Iran has said repeatedly that the situation with Iran is very different from North Korea, because Iran has never produced or attempted to produce nuclear weapons, and it believes that its problems with the United States were more political than technical. But Iran does maintain relations with North Korea, although its trade relations are much deeper with South Korea. But I think the Iranian policy is similar to that of China and Russia, and that is to decrease tensions and to maintain good relations. But Iran has nothing to do at all with the North Korean nuclear program.
All right. There has been several layers of development between Iran and the DPRK, Ms. Lim, when it comes to missile technologies and also nuclear technologies. Back in the 1980s, there was contact between the two. DPRK supplied the Scud missiles to Tehran at the time of the Iran-Iraq war. Then there was also suspicion coming from the U.S. We don't know. We cannot confirm at this moment whether there has been any technological information exchange between Iran and the DPRK on the nuclear issue, whether it's nuclear weapons or the safety use of nuclear energy. And then there has always also been a ban or a sanction against certain individuals from Iranian organization who Washington suspected at least of providing some kinds of technology and information working on the Iranian side. So what do you make of this statement coming from the Iranian president? What can South Korea expect? What does that mean? South Korea pulling away, ally of DPRK, really?
In the short term, probably this kind of messages from two presidents cannot ultimately change the Kim Jong-un's behavior or his mindset. Again, in the short term, but in the longer term, I do think I do expect this Iranian case can give some educational effect. To North Korea as well. That's my kind of hopeful statement. And plus, I don't think we actually pulling out the Iran from North Korea to our side, because that should be Iran's decision rather than our decision. But we're very actually proud and happy to see that Iran's, this kind of president's statement about the nuclear-free peninsula, not only just the peninsula and the whole region as well. So although all those presidential remarks are very encouraging, but again, I'd like to say that kind of decision should be actually up to the Iran rather than ourselves. But again, it was an encouraging moment for us.
Right. Mr. Chung, President Park from South Korea talked about the model of Iran to clear away the international community sanctions against it by coming clean, so-called. Could be a model for DPRK. Do you see that case?
Yeah, I think the Iranian deal can be a model for the peaceful solution of DPRK nuclear issue in the long term. For example, the negotiators of Iranian nuclear deal actually copied some documents from the six-part talk. This is actually a good practice from the six-part talk, over a DPRK nuclear issue. I'm sure this time after the deal made by Iran and the P5+1 over Iranian nuclear issue, of course, this will give a good example.
But Mr. Tang, let me just remind you, first of all, Iran did not withdraw from NPT, the so-called Nuclear Proliferation Treaty Organization, DPRK did. And secondly, Iran has never yet developed a nuclear bomb, at least according to official record, and also later by investigation, but DPRK has already, including some hydrogen bomb back in the month of January. So very different cases. Is it still can be a model?
That's a big difference between Iran and the DPRK over the nuclear issue. Iran, almost on its way to the nuclear armed state, but DPRK, as it announced, it had already become a nuclear weapons country. So this is a big difference, but I think there are at least three choices on the table: war, sanction, and negotiation. Are you going to wage war against each other? No. Are you going to continue the sanction? The UN Security Council has already adopted the toughest sanction against DPRK, 270. So this is actually a big choice for the countries concerned, and also for DPRK. Can DPRK, endure the burden, the pressure of the toughest sanction? I think the answer is no.
Well, we do not know the answer for the moment because things could happen at any moment, as we all know, with the party congress approaching in DPRK. Before we go, Professor Morandi, very briefly from you, what role can, well, I'm told by our producer our time is running out for this section. I'm sure we're going to have more opportunity to talk one another on this issue and many other more. For now, thank you so much, the three of you, Tang Jianxun, Yoon Lim, and also Professor Mohammad Morandi in Iran. Thank you for being with us. Stay with us here on World Insight. We got our final segment coming right up. Showdown in the skies. The U.S.-Russia fighter jets confront each other over the Baltic for a third time in recent days, escalating tensions as both sides show no signs of compromise. Welcome back. You're watching World Insight on CCTV News. Now let's turn to the Baltic Sea, where a Russian fighter jet intercepted a U.S. surveillance plane last Friday. Washington called the Russian jet's behavior unsafe and unprofessional, but Russia said their plane acted in accordance with international regulations. This is the third time interceptions of this kind since April. The rising tensions add more uncertainty to cooperation between the two powers. For example, joint efforts such as the Syria peace talks.
A close encounter. The Pentagon said last Friday that a U.S. Air Force reconnaissance plane was intercepted by the Russian fighter jets in the Baltic Sea. Washington said a Russian Su-27 fighter jet had come within 30 meters of the U.S. plane and had performed a barrel roll. The U.S. Department of Defense strongly condemned the action as unsafe and unprofessional and said that it would lead to an escalation in tensions between the two countries. On the other hand, the Russian Defense Ministry refuted the Pentagon's claim, saying its jets conducted their missions based on international regulations. Russia said that the U.S. plane was trying to sneak up to the Russian border with its transponder turned off, forcing the Russian jets to identify the type of U.S. plane with this maneuver. The Russian Defense Ministry warned the U.S. to keep their planes from Russian borders or keep their aerial transponders switched on. It's not a first military friction in recent weeks. On April the 14th, another Su-27 Russian fighter jets conducted a similar mission. And between April 11th and the 12th, the USS Donald Cook ship was flown over by Su-24 fighter jets.
There have been repeated incidents over the last year where the Russian military, including Russian military aircraft, have come close enough to each other, or have come close enough to other air and sea traffic to raise serious safety concerns and we continue to be concerned about this behavior.
Last month, the incidents reveal rising tensions between Russia and the United States over Eastern Europe. NATO is deploying an additional 4 battalions of 4,000 troops in Poland and 3 Baltic states. The so-called biggest military buildup since the end of the Cold War is likely to cause a tough response from the Russian side.
For more on that, between Russia and the United States, we're joined here in our Beijing studio by Mr. Geun-hye, who's a senior fellow at the China Institute of International Studies. Welcome, sir. Meanwhile, joining us in Washington, D.C. in the U.S., we're having Mr. Jeffrey Mankoff, senior fellow and deputy director of the Russia and Eurasia program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Welcome as well, sir. And joining us from Moscow, we're having Mr. Pavel Felgenhauer, a defense analyst in Russia. Welcome. So, who's right, who's wrong? U.S. or Russia? Let's go to Mr. Mankoff first.
Well, look, I don't think it's a question of right and wrong necessarily. I think the Russians are trying to send a message to the United States about what they see as the encroachment of U.S. and Western power towards Russian borders. And I think the United States is trying to let the Russians know that the tactical maneuvers that its aircraft are undertaking are provocative and could potentially lead, deliberately or otherwise, to unwanted incidents and have the risk of escalation. So I think that there's a complex signaling mechanism going on here on both sides, and the danger is both that the signals get misinterpreted, but also that something that neither side actually wants to happen happens. If, for example, there's a collision or other kind of accident.
Mr. Felgenhauer, according to Secretary of State Mr. Kerry, he was suggesting, quote, this is serious business. There could be a shoot down. Is Russia weighing this very carefully when actions like these are being taken?
Well, actually, the encounter in the air was between an unarmed American recon jet and a Russian fighter, so the Americans couldn't shoot down anything. They were unarmed. What Kerry was talking about, it was about a previous encounter between the destroyer Donald Cook and Russian planes that flew over very close, buzzed over. Of course, the American destroyer was well armed and could shoot them down, but the Russian planes actually apparently were recon planes, and they were unarmed. So I believe both sides don't really want this to go into a shooting stage, but are showing off. And even without shooting, there are problems can happen. You can just remember the Hanan incident in 2001, a collision between an American recon plane and the Chinese fighter south of Hanan over the South China Sea, which led to a very serious crisis, and of course the death of a Chinese pilot.
And therefore, what can Russia do?
There is an agreement of 72 during the Cold War signed by Brezhnev and Nixon about avoiding such incidents in the international airspace between military planes and on the high seas. But there are no rules. I mean, I can't say that what close is too close. But once a year, there's some kind of meeting between Russian and American military to discuss what happened during the last year and maybe put unofficial rules how to avoid incidents. But right now, when the situation between Moscow and Washington is bad, and especially in the Baltic Sea, where there's a kind of vacuum of power that's sucking in both sides, it could be much worse than a Hanan incident, because there's an overall buildup of force there, and there's much less trust between both sides than there was, say, between America and China. So this could lead to an actually ugly escalation if someone just turns the stick just a bit in the wrong direction, and then there's a collision, and then we're in a deep bad water.
Yes, indeed. Mr. Mankoff, at what level was the negotiation, or rather talk, between the two militaries about what kinds of missions and how to solve if there were crises?
As I understand it, the meetings are between the Secretary of the Navy in the United States and then his counterpart in Russia. So we're talking about the political leadership of the branches of the armed forces. And since what we're talking about here is primarily tactical maneuvers, that is how planes and ships operate rather than strategic questions about deployments, that seems to be probably the appropriate level, but especially in the last couple of months where there have been these incidents both with the American reconnaissance plane and as Pavel alluded to, the buzzing of the destroyer Donald Cook. There's very much a political element in all of this, and so I think at some point, if there's going to be an agreement, it probably has to be one that's negotiated at a higher political level as well.
Yes, that's a very interesting issue, isn't it, Mr. Yang? You are sitting here because you had a very clear memory of what happened between China and the United States about the reconnaissance plane, and that decision was, according to at least the record coming from the U.S. official side, not taken by a higher level of command, but rather very low level of command. This could happen also in the Russia and the U.S. case, some would assume.
I think both Hainan incident and the recent events we discussed really send alarms to the international community, especially to the major players. Let's set aside about question who at the responsibility of illegal or legal, and how close is too close. The controversial situation is the events happened too close to one sovereign state's border, although that's high sea or international airspace. That's true, but the location, the points is too close to a sovereignty of the states. That really matter for the security. That is the root for the incident of Hainan Island.
Right.
And if there's something unpleasant happened in the between Russia and the U.S.
On the Baltic Sea,
I think I think that's a matter on one hand. Security to one sovereign state. On the other hand, it's a technical issue. Say how close is close, or how to maneuver when and counter at sea. So whenever we talk about the illegal or legal technical issues, we should take the comprehensive security concept and the interest into the consideration.
Very interesting what you have just said. Let me come back to you, Mr. Falkenhauer. You mentioned during the Cold War an agreement somewhat was reached between then former Soviet Union and the United States. But after the Cold War, we didn't see much of those kinds of agreements, even though tension could also rise at any moment. Does it mean that we haven't done that part of the work? What kinds of mechanism is most advisable at this moment, given the fact that the two countries' relations really is not at its highest point at all?
Well, there's right now the good example of Russian and American military kind of cooperating in Syria basically to avoid such incidents. And since both air forces there are right now in action, it's very important that they don't go into action against each other. And there up to now, they did manage to avoid close brushes and, of course, avoided shooting at each other. So it can work if there is orders to do it, make it work. The same most likely could be adopted in the Baltics or in the Black Sea, where there's also some incidents of such close buzzing, to avoid a possible incident that can escalate out of control. But most likely Russia and the Russian military believe that the United States should take some kind of measures to avoid going too close to Russian base in Baltisk in the Kaliningrad enclave, which is considered a very dangerous strategically position because it's even in peacetime surrounded by NATO states and basically some NATO forces. So there could be an agreement, but that will have to most likely need first a political decision coming from the top for the military to find a way to work with each other and avoid such incidents.
I see.
Will that order come or not right now? No one knows. The situation is building up.
Right. Geopolitics certainly plays a big role, as we all know, Mr. Mankov. In fact, it is not just between the United States and Russia. It is also between Russia and some of U.S. allies in Europe. The Obama administration seemed to have acknowledged the growing and long-term threat that Russia poses to U.S. national security interests in Europe and even beyond. Obama, for example, quadrupled funding for the European Reassurance Initiative from just under $800 million in the year 2016 to $3.4 billion in the White House 2017 budget request. How much geopolitics is playing a role? Can a technical solution be sought when you have huge geopolitical strategic conflicts?
Yeah, I think the growing geopolitical confrontation between not only the United States but NATO more broadly on the one hand and Russia on the other, of course, underpins all of this. That's why you didn't have these kind of incidents in the last several years, even though NATO countries continued to border Russia and there were still a lot of political and security tensions across those borders. The fact that the political relationship was still in a relatively good place, that communication was still fairly regular, meant that on the one hand, Russia didn't see NATO activities in this region as being as provocative, and at the same time there was less fear in some of the Baltic states, Poland, and some of the other eastern flank NATO allies about the threat that Russia posed to them. It's this changed geopolitical environment which largely stems from the conflict in Ukraine and Russia's participation in it that has fed the concerns of the U.S. NATO allies in Eastern Europe and the Baltics, who have been calling for NATO to pay greater attention to their security and to roll back some of the cuts in a force posture that have been carried out over the last couple of American administrations based on the analysis that Russia no longer posed the primary threat to European security or to NATO. Given that all of that has changed so dramatically in the last couple of years, any attempt to address the specific issues of incidents at sea or in the air along this shared frontier very much have a political and a geopolitical element to them.
Right,
and
Mr. Yang, here in
the United
Beijing,
States has to take the interest of its allies.
Right, Mr. Yang here in Beijing, it is not just Russia that U.S. has an issue with, but also China, it seems, or rather, it's not just Russia that has an issue with the U.S., but China as well. Recently, China denied a port call from the U.S. Side for harboring in Hong Kong. It is part of the U.S. Plan, or rather ships of plans to have in the South China Sea. So there is also a debate about what is international water and many other things related to this. What do you make of cases like this? How should we see from China's perspective the U.S. approach to other countries when there's an issue, strategic differences or strategic potential differences? From your perspective, Mr. Yang?
Well, firstly, I would say, frankly, it's an American-style hegemony. When we talk about incidents from here to there, that's a similarity. The similarity is that is the United States that sent their strategic weapons or equipments very close to the other sovereign states' border or sea border lines. That's not the other countries sent to the U.S. That's too close strategically. Technically, some reactions may very close to the jet carrier of the United States. That's technical issue. But geopolitically, I would say U.S. now is engaged in 3 strategic campaigns from transatlantic, focus on the Russia and Middle East, Africa, North Africa to Central Asia, focus on terrorism, and Trans-Pacific, focus on China. And U.S. too aggressive, so that they provoke both Russia, U.S., China, U.S. relation in tensions. But I think all the powers are very cautious to avoid the situation from going to out of control.
Mr. Bancroft, is that a good idea?
Look, I mean, the United States has long supported the concept of freedom of the seas and free navigation through international waters, which are codified in international law, including the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which the United States unfortunately has not ratified. But within the provisions of that convention and customary international law, operations on the high seas are not restricted, and the United States has made very clear that it regards its ability to send both civilian and military ships and planes through international waters as being a fundamental right and as being something that contributes to overall geopolitical stability, and is not going to back away from those kind of operations either in the European theater or the Pacific theater.
Okay, despite the strategic rhetoric, we hope, certainly, in whatever cases we're talking about today, all sides could figure out the various pragmatic approach toward one another so that unnecessary crises should be avoided and can be avoided. Thank you so much, Yang Xiyu, Jeffrey Mankoff, and Pavel Felgenhauer. Gentlemen, thank you for being with us. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more of a program, visit our website. Just type in World Insight CCTV News into your search engine. You'll be able to find us. Or you can also check out our YouTube channel. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone at the World Insight team, thanks for watching, and tune in again next time for more insights from across China and around the world. Good night.